Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are grappling with something that, feels abstract until it is staring you right in the face. Tension.
Hmm.
You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you can just physically feel the anger radiating off two people? It's heavy, it's quiet. Now, I want you to imagine that sensation scaled up to a planetary level with the fate of civilization resting on the outcome.
It's the defining sensation of the second half of the 20th century, isn't it? It's this constant low-grade hum of anxiety. We're looking at how superpowers fight without technically fighting each other directly.
Or at least without blowing up the world in the process.
Exactly. We're unpacking the actual mechanics of the Cold War. How do you push, how do you shove when a full-blown punch means the end of everything?
And to do that, we've got a stack of really compelling sources today. We are going to be comparing two absolute boiling points in history. On one hand, we have the Korean War, which started in 1950. That was a grinding, muddy, bloody 3-year conflict.
Hot war in every sense of the word.
And on the other, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, 13 days of high-wire psychological terror, where the entire world, and I mean the entire world, held its breath.
It's a perfect A/B test for history, really.
Yeah.
These two events show us two completely different sides of the escalation ladder. One is that hot proxy war with millions of boots on the ground, massive casualties, shifting border.
Your horizontal escalation, it spreads out.
Yes. And the other is a cold standoff, a psychological game of chicken played with nuclear missiles where almost no shots were fired, yet the danger was arguably, existentially higher, a vertical escalation.
And the mission for this deep dive is to figure out why they played out so differently. We aren't just recounting dates and battles here. The sources we have allow us to really look under the hood. We want to understand the machinery behind the decisions.
Yeah, the human element. How did miscalculations, fear, ideology, how did all of that drive the U.S. and the USSR up this ladder?
And crucially, how did they get down? Because getting down is the hard part.
It is. And we have to be careful with our analysis because as the documents point out, there isn't just one narrative here. This isn't a simple good guys versus bad guys story.
No, not at all.
We have the American perspective of containment, this idea of stopping the dominoes from falling. We have the Soviet perspective of security and this deep-seated fear of Western imperialism. And crucially, we have the perspectives of the nations caught in the middle.
The Koreans and the Cubans, they weren't just chess pieces.
They had their own agency, their own goals, their own fears. So our goal is balanced reporting of these viewpoints based on what the sources tell us.
So let's establish the structure. We're going to look at the origins, how a single speech or a failed invasion can light a fuse.
Then the conflicts themselves, the real difference between fighting in trenches and staring at radar screens.
And finally, the resolution, how one ended in a stalemate that's still tense today, and the other ended in a secret backroom deal that completely changed the game.
It is a fascinating study in contrast. Shall we start at the beginning with the origins?
Let's do it. Part 1. And to set the scene, the sources really emphasize this concept of vacuums.
Right. Power vacuums. Nature hates them, and geopolitics hates them even more. If we look at Korea in 1950, the context is incredibly messy. Just a few years out of World War II.
And you have a country that was sort of arbitrarily divided at the 38th parallel.
Completely arbitrarily. It was a line drawn on a map by American planners literally in the last days of the war to accept the Japanese surrender. Soviets in the north, Americans in the south. It was never meant to be a permanent border.
But by 1950, it had hardened, and you have two very ambitious leaders on the peninsula. You have Kim Il-sung in the north and Syngman Rhee in the south.
And the sources make it crystal clear both of these guys were fervent nationalists. They weren't just waiting for orders from Moscow or Washington.
They weren't puppets.
Not at all. They both wanted to reunify the country, but on their own ideological terms. They were constantly provoking each other across the board. It was a tinderbox.
So Kim Il-sung spent years, literally years, lobbying Stalin for permission to invade the South. And Stalin kept saying no.
He kept saying no. He was deeply cautious. Stalin was terrified of a direct war with America. The U.S. had the atomic bomb. They had a massive industrial base. He didn't want any part of that.
But then something changes. The sources point to two key events. First, in 1949, both U.S. and Soviet troops withdrew. They just left.
They packed up and went home. And that creates this sense of opportunity, the vacuum we talked about.
And then comes the slip-up. The sources highlight a specific speech by U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson in early 1950.
January 1950.
Right.
At the National Press Club.
Right. And he's giving a speech about the U.S. defensive perimeter in Asia.
Right.
He's listing the vital areas the U.S. is committed to defending. He lists the Aleutians, Japan, the Philippines.
And he stops there.
He leaves Korea out. He literally leaves the Korean peninsula off the list of places the U.S. has an automatic commitment to defend. Now, put yourself in the shoes of Stalin or Kim Il-sung listening to that broadcast. What do you hear?
You hear a green light. You hear, if we invade, the Americans won't fight. It sounds like an open invitation.
Was it a mistake? Or was it intentional?
The debate still rages, but most historians think it was a genuine catastrophic blunder, an oversight. He was describing the current military reality, not making a grand strategic promise, but the nuance was lost.
And Kim Il-sung pounces on it.
It goes back to Stalin. And the sources tell us that this speech, combined with the second key factor, the communist victory in China in 1949, is what finally changes Stalin's mind.
So Mao's victory makes Stalin feel more confident.
Much more confident. He now has this massive, powerful communist ally in the region. He thinks the North Koreans can sweep in, unify the country in a few weeks, and the U.S. will just complain from the sidelines in Japan. It seemed like a low-risk gamble for a new puppet state.
But he adds a condition.
He does. Stalin made his approval conditional on Mao Zedong supporting Kim. He wanted to make sure China had skin in the game. And Mao, driven by revolutionary enthusiasm, agreed.
So the origin of the Korean War is rooted in a misunderstanding, an assumption about the enemy's will. It's about opportunistic expansion into what they thought was a vacuum.
Exactly. Now let's pivot to Cuba 12 years later, 1962. Is this also about expansion?
It doesn't feel like it. The context is so different.
That's a whole different ballgame. If Korea was about expansion and opportunism, Cuba was about defense and leverage.
Okay, let's unpack that. The timeline here is tight. Fidel Castro takes power in 1959. Initially, the sources say he's just a nationalist revolutionary overthrowing a brutal dictator, Batista.
He wasn't explicitly a Soviet pawn at the start. He was trying to chart his own course.
But their relationship with the U.S. soured incredibly fast.
Almost overnight. The U.S. refused to buy Cuban sugar, they refused to supply oil to Cuban refineries, there were assassination plots, and the rhetoric got incredibly heated. Castro had to look for another patron to survive.
And the Soviets are right there, ready to help.
Of course. It's a huge propaganda victory for them. A socialist state, 90 miles from Florida. But the real trigger event, the thing that changes everything, is in 1961, the Bay of Pigs.
This is the CIA-backed invasion by Cuban exiles that was supposed to overthrow Castro.
And it was a disaster. A total military and diplomatic failure for the Kennedy administration. It was humiliating. But for Castro and for the Soviets, specifically for Khrushchev, it sent a very, very clear message.
What message was that?
The United States wants regime change in Cuba, and they will absolutely try again. They're not going to let this go.
So Castro needs protection. That explains the defensive motivation. But why nukes? I mean, that's a huge leap. Why not just send Soviet troops, tanks, conventional bombers? Why put nuclear missiles right on America's doorstep?
It's a great question, and the sources point to a dual motivation here. First, yes, protection. Khrushchev genuinely wanted to save the Cuban Revolution. He saw it as a socialist success story right under the nose of the Americans, and he wanted to guarantee its survival. A nuclear deterrent is the ultimate guarantee.
Okay, so that's reason one. What's the other?
The other reason is pure strategic balance, or rather imbalance.
A balance of power.
Correct. At this time, the U.S. had a massive advantage in long-range nuclear delivery systems, bombers and ICBMs. But more importantly, and this is the key detail, the U.S. had placed Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy.
Let's define the Jupiter missile for a second. These are medium-range ballistic missiles.
Yes, nuclear tipped. And from Turkey, they could strike the Soviet heartland, Moscow, Kyiv, the industrial centers, in a matter of minutes, maybe 10, 15 minutes. There was virtually no warning time.
So it was an existential threat to the Soviet Union.
An absolute existential threat. And Khrushchev explicitly said in his memoirs that he wanted the Americans to learn what it feels like. He wanted them to have a taste of their own medicine, to feel that same vulnerability. It was about parity. It was payback.
So let's synthesize the origins. In Korea, the origin is, they won't stop us, let's take this ground. It's proactive, it's aggressive.
Right. It's based on a bad read of U.S. politics.
In Cuba, the origin is reactive. It's we need to stop them from invading, and we need to even the score for those missiles in Turkey.
Precisely. Korea was an opportunistic gamble. Cuba was a high-stakes defensive and strategic gamble. Two totally different starting points that lead to two totally different kinds of crises.
Okay, so the stage is set. The fuse is lit in both scenarios. Now let's look at the explosion itself. Let's move to part two. the nature of escalation. Because these two events looked and felt completely different to the people living through them.
Night and day. Korea became a hot war almost instantly.
June 25, 1950, the North Korean People's Army just steamrolls across the 38th parallel.
It was a blitzkrieg. They were well-trained, well-equipped by the Soviets. The South Korean army basically collapsed. And this is where the U.S. miscalculation from Atchison's speech comes back to bite them.
They realize they can't just watch.
They can't. Truman and his advisors immediately see this as a test of the entire containment policy. If Korea falls, what's next? Japan? The Philippines? What about West Berlin? They felt they had to draw a line in the sand.
So the U.S. goes to the UN. And here's that detail again that always surprises me. The Soviets weren't there to veto the action.
It is a massive, unforced diplomatic blunder. The Soviets were boycotting the UN Security Council.
Why? What were they protesting?
They were protesting the UN's refusal to give Communist China's seat to Mao's government. The seat was still held by the nationalists who had fled to Taiwan. So in protest, the Soviet ambassador just wasn't in the room.
Wow.
If he had been in the room, he would have raised his hand, vetoed the intervention, and the Korean War would have been a very, very different story. But he wasn't.
So the UN authorizes a police action, which is just a polite way of saying war.
A full-scale war. And initially, as you mentioned, it goes terribly for the UN forces. The North pushes the South and the Americans all the way down to the Pusan perimeter. Just a tiny corner of the Southeast Peninsula. They were almost pushed into the sea.
It looked like a total defeat.
It did. And then comes General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific in World War II.
And he executes the landing at Incheon.
A brilliant, incredibly risky amphibious maneuver. Incheon has some of the worst tides in the world, massive mudflats. Everyone in the Pentagon thought it was a suicidal idea.
But it worked.
It worked spectacularly.
Right.
He lands the Marines way behind enemy lines. It completely cuts the North Korean supply lines. The North Korean army in the south just disintegrates. The UN forces retake Seoul. They push the North Koreans back to the 38th parallel.
And here is where the escalation ladder gets really slippery, because they reached their initial objective. They had saved South Korea, but they didn't stop at the border, did they?
No. And this is the critical escalation point. Success breeds ambition. The U.S. goal and the UN goal shifted. It went from containment, just saving the South, to rollback.
Rollback. What does that mean in practical terms?
It means liberating the North, conquering it, unifying the entire peninsula under Syngman Rhee, and eliminating communism from Korea entirely. So they crossed the parallel and headed north towards the Yalu River.
Which is the border with China.
The border with China. And this absolutely terrified Mao Zedong. The sources are clear that Mao genuinely feared the U.S. would use Korea as a launching pad to invade China itself and try to reverse the communist revolution.
No, he couldn't have a hostile American army on his border.
Absolutely not. So, despite warnings from his own generals, he makes the decision to intervene. He sends in the People's Volunteer Army.
Volunteers in very heavy quotes.
Right. These were regular Chinese army units, seasoned veterans of the Chinese Civil War. 300,000 of them pour across the Yalu River at night. And suddenly, the UN forces are caught completely by surprise and are being pushed back in a chaotic, frozen retreat.
So the war escalates again. It goes from a civil war to a UN intervention to a full-blown war between the U.S. and China.
It globalized the Cold War. Escalation here meant more troops, more land, more countries. It was horizontal, spreading out across the map.
Okay. Now contrast that with Cuba. The escalation there wasn't about taking territory at all.
Not in the slightest. It was vertical escalation. It was about the intensity of the threat, second by second.
It starts on October 14th, 1962. A U-2 spy plane takes these high-altitude photos of the Cuban jungle.
And the photo analysts back in D.C. are looking at them, and they see the distinctive star-shaped pattern of a Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile site being constructed.
Undeniable proof.
Undeniable. And President Kennedy is immediately briefed, and he secretly sets up the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, to decide what to do.
And the sources we have, the transcripts of these meetings, are just terrifying to read.
They are. The military leadership, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they are pushing hard. They want immediate airstrikes to destroy the missiles before they become operational. Then they want a full invasion of Cuba.
General Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force, basically called Kennedy a coward for hesitating.
He did. The military saw it as a simple problem with a simple solution. Overwhelming force. But Kennedy hesitated. Why?
Why did he?
Because he understood the chain reaction. He knew that if he bombs Cuba, the Soviets can't just take it. They might retaliate by taking West Berlin, or even worse, What if the local Soviet commanders in Cuba decide to launch the missiles they do have before they're destroyed?
Escalation here happens in the mind. It's purely psychological.
It's a game of chess where every piece is a city. So after days of debate, they decide on inalt path, a quarantine.
And the word choice is so important.
Oh, absolutely. A blockade is an act of war under international law. A quarantine sounds medical, defensive, safer. It was a naval ring around Cuba to stop any more offensive military shipments from getting in.
But this leads to that famous image, the eyeball to eyeball moment. You have Soviet cargo ships steaming towards American warships.
And the whole world is watching. The U.S. forces go to DEFCON 2.
Which is the highest readiness level in history, short of actual declared war.
It's the only time it's ever happened. Strategic Air Command bombers are in the air with live nukes on board, circling 24/7, ready to go to their targets in the USSR.
The tension here isn't about gaining ground on a map, it's about time. It's about waiting for the other guy to blink.
Exactly. Khrushchev used a very visceral metaphor in a letter to Kennedy. He called it the rope of war. He said that the more they pulled on the ends of the rope, the tighter the knot of war would get, until the only way to untie it would be to cut it with a sword.
Meaning nuclear war. That is a chilling image.
It is. So in Korea, you have the messiness of ground warfare, rud, snow, retreats taking hills. In Cuba, you have silence, waiting, watching radar screens, and the terrifying intimate knowledge that one wrong move ends human civilization.
That's the difference between a proxy war and a direct confrontation. In Korea, the superpowers fought through others. In Cuba, they were staring right at each other.
And their fingers were on the button.
This brings us to the people making these decisions. Let's move to part 3, leadership and dangerous gambles. Because in both cases, you have this incredible clash between military logic and political logic.
Absolutely. In Korea, that clash was personified by two men, General MacArthur and President Truman.
MacArthur was the hero of WWII. He was this larger-than-life figure, a demigod in the eyes of the American public, and he wanted to win.
He wanted total victory. To him, the concept of a limited war was absurd. When China entered the war and pushed his forces back, MacArthur wanted to expand the conflict dramatically.
What did he propose?
He requested permission to bomb targets inside China factories, supply depots. He wanted to blockade the Chinese coast. He even suggested, in private, using nuclear weapons to create a radioactive wasteland along the Yalu River to permanently stop the Chinese advance.
That's extreme.
To him, war was an absolute. He famously said, "There is no substitute for victory."
But Truman saw it differently.
Truman was looking at the global map. He was terrified of this becoming World War III. He knew that if he bombed China, the Soviet Union, who had a defense treaty with China, might be forced to enter the war. And then you have Soviet tanks rolling into Western Europe.
So you have the general on the ground saying, let me finish them, and the president in the White House saying, no, we have to hold the line.
And it got so bad. MacArthur started publicly criticizing the president's strategy, writing letters to congressmen, essentially trying to go over his commander-in-chief's head.
And Truman does the unthinkable.
He fires him. He fires Douglas MacArthur for insubordination. It was a politically suicidal move for Truman at the time. MacArthur came home to ticker tape parades. Truman's approval ratings plummeted.
But in hindsight,
The sources suggest it was a crucial, maybe one of the most important, assertions of civilian control over the military in American history. Truman accepted a bloody stalemate rather than risking global nuclear war. He chose the lesser of two evils.
now compare that to the leadership dynamic in the Cuban crisis.
Yeah.
You have Khrushchev and you have Kennedy.
Khrushchev's a fascinating character here. The sources quote Alan Dulles, the CIA director, describing him as the most dangerous person to lead the Soviet Union.
Why? More dangerous than Stalin.
In a way, yes. Because Stalin, for all his brutality, was paranoid and calculated. Khrushchev was a gambler. He took risks Stalin never would have. Putting missiles in Cuba was a massive, massive gamble. He gambled Kennedy was young and inexperienced and would just accept it.
A huge
The
miscalculation.
huge one. And when Kennedy didn't back down, Khrushchev had to scramble. Now, on the American side, you have Kennedy, and much like Truman, he had to fight his own military advisors.
We mentioned General LeMay wanting to bomb the missile sites.
LeMay, the rest of the Joint Chiefs. They were all pushing for military action. They thought Kennedy was being weak, that he was choosing appeasement. They called the quarantine a wimp's response.
If Kennedy had listened to his generals in October 1962, what happens?
We almost certainly have a nuclear exchange. It's that simple. We found out years later, after the Cold War ended, that the Soviet commanders in Cuba had tactical nuclear weapons. smaller battlefield nukes.
Oh, wow.
And they had the local authority to use them if Cuba was invaded by the U.S.
Ah.
An American invasion force landing on the beaches would have been vaporized by a tactical nuke.
And the U.S. response to that would have been,
A full strategic response against the Soviet Union, it would have been the end of the world. Kennedy, by resisting his generals and seeking a political path, saved the world. It's not an exaggeration.
so in both cases, the political leaders, Truman and Kennedy, had to act as the brake on the military impulse. They had to be the so-called rational actors.
But that's the scary part, the rational actor problem. Because rationality can fail. In Korea, it failed initially. Stalin was irrational to think the U.S. wouldn't fight. MacArthur was irrational to think China wouldn't fight. These misjudgments led to a prolonged, bloody war.
But in Cuba.
In Cuba, the fear was so immediate, so absolute, that it induced rationality. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev stared into the abyss of mutually assured destruction Mad-E, and they realized it was not a theory, it was real. The sheer terror of the outcome forced them to find a way out.
It's an incredible irony. The higher the stakes got, the more cautious and rational they were forced to be.
The fear of escalation became the best de-escalator.
Which leads us directly to how these things actually ended. Part 4, resolution. And again, the contrast is just stark. Korea ends in this bloody, frustrating stalemate.
It just bogs down. After the Chinese intervention in late 1950 and early 1951, the war settles into this brutal war of attrition right around the 38th parallel, basically where it started.
Why did it drag on for 2 more years if the lines weren't moving?
Negotiations, and specifically one incredibly difficult issue, prisoners of war, the POWs.
What was the issue with the prisoners?
The UN, led by the U.S., insisted on voluntary repatriation. They didn't want to forcibly send North Korean and Chinese prisoners back to communist regimes if they didn't want to go. A lot of them wanted to defect. The communists insisted that every single prisoner be returned, forcibly if necessary.
And they fought for 2 years over this.
They fought and died for 2 years, over hills with names like Pork Chop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge, just to gain leverage at the negotiating table in Panmunjom. It was a horrific, grinding slog.
So what finally broke the deadlock?
2 things, really. First, Dwight Eisenhower was elected president in 1952, and he hinted he might be willing to use nuclear weapons to end the war. That put pressure on the Chinese.
But the bigger factor.
The bigger factor was the death of Joseph Stalin in March of 1953. Stalin died, and the new Soviet leadership, Malenkov and Khrushchev, wanted to ease tensions with the West. They wanted to focus on their own domestic economy. They didn't want this constant drain in Korea anymore, so they pressured the North Koreans and the Chinese to compromise.
And an armistice was signed in July 1953. But notice the word, it's an armistice. It is not a peace treaty.
That is the crucial takeaway. Technically, the Korean War never ended. It just paused. And the result was a divided peninsula, a heavily armed border, millions dead, entire cities ruined. It was a tragedy of attrition that solved nothing permanently.
Now, compare that to the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It wasn't a 2-year negotiation. It happened over a single weekend.
It happened through secret, desperate backroom deals, and it all centered on the famous 2 letters from Khrushchev.
Right, let's talk about those because it's like something out of a spy novel. The first letter arrives on Friday, October 26th.
It does, and it's emotional, it's rambling, almost incoherent in places. It's clearly written by Khrushchev himself. He's talking about the horror of war, and he essentially offers a deal. We'll remove the missiles if you, the United States, publicly promise never to invade Cuba.
And the XCOM team reads this and thinks, okay, we can work with this. This is an off-ramp.
They're relieved. But then the next day, a Saturday, a second letter arrives, and it's completely different.
Oh, so?
It's stiff, formal, clearly written by the foreign ministry. And it's much more demanding. It says, we will take our missiles out of Cuba if you take your Jupiter missiles out of Turkey.
The Turkey trade. This was the sticking point. The U.S. couldn't publicly agree to that, could they?
No way. It would look like they buckled under Soviet threats. It would shatter the confidence of their NATO allies. You threaten us, and we remove our defenses. It was a non-starter, publicly.
So what do? They have 2 contradictory offers on the table.
They come up with a brilliant, if slightly duplicitous solution. It's sometimes called the trollop ploy, after a character in a novel who pretends she didn't receive a letter she didn't like.
They decided to just ignore the second letter.
They decided to ignore the second letter and reply only to the first one. They sent a public message to Moscow accepting the no invasion for missiles deal.
But that's not the whole story.
Not at all. That was the public move. The private move was even more important. The president's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, met secretly with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin.
And what did he tell him?
He made a verbal, off-the-record deal. He said, look, the Jupiter missiles in Turkey are obsolete anyway. We're already planning to remove them. We will take them out, but we'll do it in 4 or 5 months, and it can never, ever be announced as part of this deal. If you talk about it publicly, the deal is off.
That is incredible statecraft. They gave Khrushchev the substance of what he wanted, the removal of the threat on his border, but they denied him the public victory.
And it worked. The next morning, Moscow radio announced that the missiles would be dismantled. The Soviet ships turned around. This is when Secretary of State Dean Rusk made that famous comment. We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked.
But in reality, the other fellow didn't just blink. He got a pretty significant concession.
He did. But the world saw it as a clear American victory. And the resolution wasn't a 2-year grind. It was an immediate, sudden release of pressure. The crisis was over.
Okay, so one ends in a frozen conflict, the other in a secret compromise. This is the perfect lead-in to our last big section, Part 5, the aftermath. How did these two crises change the DNA of the Cold War? What was the legacy?
The Korean War left a legacy of militarization. The sources mention NSC 68 heavily here.
That's the National Security Council report number 68. For our listeners, what did it actually do?
It was a top-secret policy paper from early 1950 that argued for a massive, across-the-board military buildup to confront the perceived threat of global communism. Before Korea, there was a big debate in Washington about defense spending. Truman wanted to cut costs.
So NSC 68 was just a proposal at that point.
It was. But the invasion of South Korea was the proof of concept that the authors of NSC 68 needed. It seemed to prove everything they had been arguing. After Korea, the U.S. defense budget tripled.
Tripled. That is the birth of the permanent military-industrial complex right there.
It really is. And it solidified the alliance systems. NATO, which had been mostly a political alliance, became a real integrated military force with a unified command structure. The U.S. pushed for the rearmament of West Germany.
And they created new alliances.
Yes, they created SEATO in Southeast Asia and CENTO in the Middle East. Korea turned the Cold War into a truly global zero-sum game. Every spot on the map mattered. Every insurgency was seen as part of a monolithic communist plot.
It created the logic that led directly to Vietnam, the idea that if we don't stop them here, the dominoes will fall.
Exactly. Korea convinced American planners that they could fight and win limited wars in Asia to stop communism. They tragically misapplied that lesson in Vietnam a decade later. Now look at the legacy of Cuba. It went the other way. If Korea led to militarization, Cuba led to regulation.
Because they had scared themselves stiff.
They had scared themselves to death. They realized they had come to the very edge of the cliff and looked over. So the first thing they did was establish the hotline.
A direct communication link between the White House and the Kremlin.
Yes, a teletype machine at first. So they wouldn't have to rely on slow back-channel diplomacy or public radio broadcasts during the next crisis. Direct, instant communication became key.
And they started talking about arms control.
They did. They signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, banning atmospheric tests. And later, the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968. They started trying to put some guardrails on this out-of-control nuclear arms race.
But there were personal costs, too. Khrushchev was ousted a couple of years later in 1964. The sources say his humiliation over Cuba was a big part of that.
It was. The perception among the hardliners in the Kremlin was that he blinked, that he'd been weak. And just as importantly, the Soviet military was deeply humiliated by the quarantine. They couldn't challenge the U.S. Navy.
So what did they do?
They vowed never to be weak at sea again. The Cuban Missile Crisis sparked a massive Soviet naval expansion program. So while it led to nuclear treaties, it also led to a different kind of arms race on the high seas.
So if we were to ask the winner debate question.
In Korea, who won?
Sure.
South Korea survived and is now a thriving democracy, so that's a U.S. victory for containment. North Korea survived and is still a thorn in the side of the West, so that's a Chinese and Soviet victory for security. But the country was destroyed. It feels like everyone, especially the Koreans, lost.
And Cuba.
You could argue everyone won in a strange way. The U.S. got the missiles out, and Kennedy looked like a strong, decisive leader. The USSR protected Cuba from invasion, Castro's regime survived, and they secretly got the Turkey missiles removed. It was a compromise that both sides could just barely live with.
There is one figure we haven't touched on enough in the aftermath, Fidel Castro. The sources say he was furious at how it ended.
Oh, he was livid. Absolutely beside himself, he wasn't even consulted during the final negotiations. Khrushchev and Kennedy settled the fate of his country over his head.
He was a pawn.
He realized that despite all the rhetoric about socialist brotherhood, Cuba was just a strategic asset, a pawn in the superpower game. The sources say he smashed mirrors in his office, he was screaming at the Soviet ambassador. It was a very harsh reality check for him.
It is. And it brings us to the synthesis of all this. What do these two events, taken together, tell us about the Cold War?
I think Korea showed the superpowers what a hot war looked like in the nuclear age. It showed them that proxy wars are messy, bloody, incredibly expensive, and often indecisive. It showed them the horrifying cost of conventional fighting.
And Cuba showed them what a nuclear war would look like.
Exactly. It showed them the abyss. Total, final annihilation. And together, these two crises defined the rules of the road for the next 30 years of the Cold War.
They learned a very specific lesson.
A very specific lesson. Fight through proxies, yes. Support insurgencies, yes. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola. But never, ever let it get to a direct eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between the U.S. and the USSR again.
They learned how to manage the tension. They learned how to fight without everyone dying.
That's a good way to put it.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, looking at the big picture, the so what for the listener. We often think of history as these separate chapters. Chapter 1 is Korea, Chapter 2 is Cuba.
But they are so deeply connected. The psychology flows from one to the other.
The sources imply this fascinating interconnectedness. The U.S. saw Korea as a test of their resolve. If they hadn't fought there, they believed the Soviets would have been bolder in Europe, maybe even gone after West Berlin.
And Khrushchev saw Cuba as giving the U.S. a taste of their own medicine. It was a direct response to the pressure he felt from U.S. missiles in Turkey.
So here is a final provocative thought to leave you with. The sources suggest a fluidity to this global conflict. If the U.S. had not intervened in Korea, would Khrushchev have even been bold enough to try putting missiles in Cuba 12 years later? Or would he have tried to take West Berlin?
And conversely, if the U.S. had invaded Cuba in 1962 and a nuclear war had been averted somehow, would the Soviets have retaliated by blockading Berlin or by sponsoring a war somewhere else?
It suggests that the Cold War wasn't a series of isolated events at all. It was a single, fluid, global siege. A push in Asia caused a pull in Europe. A missile in Turkey caused a crisis in the Caribbean. The world wasn't just connected by trade and diplomacy. It was connected like one giant planetary nervous system.
In 1950 and 1962, that nervous system reacted violently. It went into seizure.
And we are just incredibly lucky that the system didn't shut down completely.
Indeed. Very lucky.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and keep watching the tension. You never know where the next push will come from.